There's a wonderful plugin, Google Earth plugin, that you can pick a city and slide backwards 30 years. And you can see suburban sprawl 30 years ago, today, 30 years ago. And it looks like parasitic infestation. And what we're trying to do is say, wait a second, we want to put a slider bar to go forward 50 years. What does life look like inside a ReGen Villages and outside ReGen Villages for the wider external community? So you slide the bar forward and it shows the blossoming, fruiting abundance and surplus, the positive externalities, reduce burdens on healthcare systems, fostering new economic models, brokering peaceful, happy places. I mean, gosh, that's not such a utopian idea. All we have to do is just put logical infrastructure in place.
Welcome to the Regenerative Real Estate Podcast, a show about human environments and how they can be used as a force for good. Conversations that educate and inspire people looking for a different way to do real estate. I'm Neal Collins, and in this episode, I'm joined by Jame Ehrlich, entrepreneur in residence at Stanford University and founder of ReGen Villages, a tech-driven company that seeks to design regenerative and resilient communities focused on food, water, energy, and circular waste management. It was several years ago that I heard about ReGen Villages, and I wasn't sure what to make of it. You see, it was a simple yet elegant website that spoke of a global eco-village development company. On it, it toted renderings of modern Scandinavian-style homes and glass solariums with vertical farms. It spoke of creating new communities aided by machine learning to help design and deliver a residential experience complete with organic food, renewable energy, and fresh water. There were even articles about the company on popular media sites that touted a slogan that called ReGen Villages the Tesla of eco-villages. Now, I wouldn't consider myself a Luddite by any stretch, but I do admit to having a healthy dose of skepticism about the role of high tech within the field of regenerative real estate. I've come to realize that my skepticism isn't about technology per se, but about my experience feeling like we've wasted decades and squandered precious resources in the pursuit of technological advancement. I find this interview with Jame Ehrlich quite timely, as artificial intelligence has become integrated into the mainstream lexicon in what seems like a very short amount of time. Jame has been on the pioneering edge of AI within his academic and entrepreneurial career, and is a believer that the technology has a role in how we design our homes and our neighborhoods. I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation with Jame and found his background and his vision both interesting and compelling. He is certainly a distinguished serial entrepreneur, a researcher and lecturer at Stanford University, a senior fellow at the NASA Ames Research Center, and even a background producing in an award-winning PBS show called Organic Living that showcased organic and biodynamic family farms. So without further ado, let's get into it with Jame Ehrlich talking about his background and his entrepreneurial journey with ReGen Villages. I'm really excited to get into this, and I like to back up before ReGen Villages and everything that you have going right now. Because I'm really curious what these patterns are of people that are doing such interesting work in the world, like where they really came from. I'm curious where you grew up. You're you're in California right now at Stanford, but what did you grow up on the West Coast or somewhere
I
else?
grew up in New York City. I grew up in the heart of urban New York, between New York City and Long Island. So I had a little bit of a bridge between some open space and urban, but tough crocodile skin New York City in the 70s. That's my upbringing. But also a wonderful melting pot of cultures and especially around food. I'm a foodie and New York was like 24/7. You could get anything you wanted delivered even at 3 in the morning. You just needed money. That's all, like any other big city. So that's where I hail from originally. And my undergrad was from New York University, and where I was involved and interested in both computer science because I'm really interested in video games back then and media. And I had this sort of idea about storytelling through technology from quite a while ago. So that's how I then got inspired to move out to the West Coast and to move to Northern California. That's how that happened.
And what did that look like coming together with the technology and the storytelling? I know that you get into film, but around a really interesting entry point that I'd love to spend a couple of minutes at least getting into that, because I in my homework, I'm like, this is a juicy bit of the story that I know we're going to build into very different stuff, but it seems like that would your storytelling endeavors really formed a foundation, if I'm not wrong.
That is correct. Yes. So basically, my love for video games started with Atari, and then Sega and Nintendo, etc. And when I moved out to Northern California to start a software company with some friends who were living north of the Golden Gate Bridge in a beautiful place called Marin County. And they were actually working directly with George Lucas, Industrial Light and Magic. And so there was this wonderful connectivity between digital special effects for motion pictures. Now, if you're saying something, this is way back in the early 1990s. This was the beginning of digital rotoscoping and digital effects that was just being born in that moment, and we were part of that, kind of like moment in history, and also a little bit of a transcendence from, if you will, from the cartridge games to CD-ROM gaming. But moreover, I was really drawn to this whole craft, if you will, because it allows you to imagine the impossible. It allows you to think about worlds and alternate realities that are beautiful and flourishing and interesting, and create the rules that work in these worlds for the right kind of players who do the right kinds of things. So I was always big on databases and data sets that had to do with karma and karma points for doing the right things. Of course, giving people the choice to do the wrong things and have consequences, but having the right things. That was a pivotal, starting point for me in this journey. The other was the fact that coming from New York and being a foodie and coming to Northern California, I started to get introduced to these local small plot family farmers, organic, biodynamic farming, and connectivity to these farm to table experiences, which was so lovely and so powerful, transcendental kind of feelings of happiness, right? Eating this food that was just sourced from the land and cooking together with friends. And I was really trying to explore, like, why am I so happy eating these meals? And that's what spurred the next kind of storytelling journey for me, where I decided to start doing case study research to film interviews with family farmers and tracking where their food was going. Schools, elder care, restaurants. And what ended up happening was we realized that we had the basis of a public television cooking show. So we started actually producing a TV cooking series called Organic Living. And there's an interesting point about this, because back in the year 2000, when we kicked the show off, the word organic literally market tested as compost and manure or shit. I mean, like, in other words, imagine the process that word had to go through to be cleaned and cleansed to come to a place where it is now, which is 30-40% more at the store. But we were part of this magical journey in telling stories about where the food was coming from, where it was going, and the healthy outcomes related, to that. So yeah, that's kind of the genesis of where I started to learn about Rudolf Steiner, about farming principles that are connected to celestial planning. Seems esoteric, but it only makes sense. To Buckminster Fuller, in terms of resource-driven mechanical engineering and design thinking. Bill Mollison, in terms of permaculture. All these great shoulders that we stand on. Anyway, that's a long-winded, circuitous route to ReGen Villages.
Yeah, but it's such an interesting blend, because if you're pulling from that ecological world and really our relationship to our places and our food on one hand, but also like smack dab in the middle of technology and gaming, and blending that, you start to see, at least for me, it's like, oh, these are the threads that you start to weave with. And
right.
How do we get into habitation and bringing these together? I mean, you're in Silicon Valley, that's the epicenter. There's a lot of moving parts around that. It's also the epicenter of that farm to table movement with Alice Waters, and some just like amazing food scene. It still sounds like it's developing, but it's not fully baked. By the time you're producing television for around farm to table and organic cooking, what came next?
Well, basically, a lot of things happened, because of technology. We were producing very beautiful long form content. We were excited because we were one of the first Google video public television series. We had reached an audience of over 35 million homes a week on national public television. We also had a commercial version of the show on Granite Broadcasting, which was, I think, in like 34 commercial stations. Quite a success, right? From a very grassroots public access starting TV program. Most public access programs don't make it very far, but we worked very hard, and we hit this sort of almost like jam band, Grateful Dead kind of like meme or thread way before Facebook and Instagram and TikTok and all these things. We were getting a lot of interest from these stations around the country, and that led us to then publish a companion cookbook that I co-authored on Hachette back in 2007, which was also an amazing accomplishment, because the stories in that cookbook were more than just about recipes. There were also these stories about regenerative resiliency. So the building blocks of these self-reliant neighborhoods, sort of inherent in that cookbook, if you will, including electric mobility and the Burning Man movement and all this kind of interesting cutting edge sort of thinking. So fast forward a bit, in 2012, I came to Stanford University and I got involved in what's called the Solar Decathlon. And if you're familiar with the Solar Decathlon, it's an annual, used to be Department of Energy competition. It's now a global competition that looks at the single family home context that's energy positive. So passive home, energy positive design. It has to be built in a way that's flat pack and can be shipped to a designated location where that house is going to be built as part of an exhibition. But it has to be livable, because at the end of the competition, it has to be deconstructed and shipped back to campus and rebuilt, and someone has to live in it. So it's a wonderful exercise, right? Not an inexpensive research initiative. It's 18 months in design, but only 2 weeks to build. Those are the rules. 2 weeks you have to build on site. So it's a little bit nerve-wracking on that side. However, I came into that cohort, and I think I was 5 minutes into the research, and I basically went to the professors and I said, look, it occurs to me that a smart house inside of a dumb neighborhood doesn't make much sense. That we ought to be really thinking about the sort of sentient neighborhood infrastructure around permaculture and water flows and waste to resource management in marriage with energy positive typologies, so that we're really maximizing the network effect. And I was really lucky because we had the professors back then, was Professor Larry Leifer and Chris Ford, and they all basically said, with design empathy, that's a really interesting idea. Let's do it. And all of a sudden, next thing I know, I'm sort of self-funding some research on campus and off campus, and ReGen Villages was essentially born in 2012 at Stanford. And we predicted, and were quite predictive, that within 10 years, that machine learning and AI and robotic assisted services would become prevalent. And we were also predictive about the climate change anomalies, and that maybe there would be things that would start to make cities feel less comfortable. A lot of people thought our predictions were, let's say, laughable, not real. I don't know whatever you want to call it. So we suffered some slings and arrows along the way, because who could defy this great trend towards the city, right? But we said, hey, any kind of thing that could happen could make a city feel less safe, whether it's a hurricane, an earthquake, tornado, COVID, let's say. And that's what happened. COVID hit, and all of a sudden, a lot of the things that we predicted started to happen and come true. And now the same thing with AI and machine learning. So we're seeing all of those things happen.
Well, I can certainly see, if you're talking 2014, like the climate change conversation was already on its way. But what gave you the insight or the confidence around machine learning and AI, where I feel like for a lot of people, it's a topic that's really just come onto the mainstream awareness quite quickly? I mean, it's been percolating, but I don't think a lot of people have the adjacency to that conversation. Do you attribute that to, I don't know, the environment on Stanford campus, or like what in your crystal ball, what gave you that confidence around machine learning?
Well, it's still nascent. I mean, let's be clear. It's still just like in the Model A, Model T form, right? It has a lot of iterations to go before it's capable of doing a lot of the things that we should either be happy about or very concerned about. But I feel like you have to just sort of understand Moore's law, right? Which is this equation that essentially says that technology is just going to keep exponentially improving. And yes, there are some limiting factors. There's, obviously energy requirements and storage requirements and processing requirements and all these different things. But the nature of how we've evolved as a species, if you think about it, the average person 100 years ago would not have imagined that we would be where we are right now, having this conversation so many miles from each other, virtually seeing each other. It was the product of sort of sci-fi and comic book, kinds of things. And previous to that, it was just considered impossible, absolutely impossible that any of these things could happen. So I feel like the one strength that machine learning doesn't possess currently, that humans do have, is the ability to imagine the impossible. And that's something that's so powerful, because as we imagine it, and as we will it, and as we create stories around it, it becomes a building block for aha moments for people to start to design and think about solutions. And that's how we've seen just about everything that was previously thought to be impossible now not only possible, but become actually ubiquitous.
Mm. So with the name ReGen Villages, regeneration is also one of those terms that has gained a lot of traction recently. But whenever you're first putting these blocks together in your mind, what's the intentionality behind ReGen and Villages? Because I've seen a lot of articles. This is the future of cities and they reference your stuff, but it's like, he's not talking about cities. I think that there's a lot of intention behind this that some people might be missing.
Well, the word regen does represent regenerative. In Dutch and in German, Regen means rain, which is, I think, quite poetic. Maybe not so much for them because they get so much of it typically, but for us here in California, Regen is pretty nice, But the idea of ReGen Villages was initially born from the goal to supplant suburban sprawl with a better way forward for greenfield development. Now, we don't ignore cities. We're not against cities. We're definitely interested in using our Village OS software for retrofit design thinking, which I call overlays, right? To get to those interstitial gaps in places where we can have resiliency measures. But the initial thesis has and kind of continues to be that we can look at open space, currently zoned agricultural land. Most of the time, it can be even fallow land or land that even needs to be remediated. And to imagine the right kind of density, housing density that's a social, affordable, accessible budget, including market rate to those communities, but where the majority of the land is supportive of how those people can provide for themselves. Clean water, renewable energy, waste to resource management, and yes, high yield, artisanal, delicious food production that enables these communities to blossom and fruit and flourish. And there's a wonderful plugin. It's a Google Earth plugin that you can slide backwards 30 years. Pick a city and slide backwards 30 years. And you can see suburban sprawl 30 years ago, today, 30 years ago. And it looks like parasitic infestation. There's no other way to look at it. And what we're trying to do is say, wait a second, we want to put a slider bar to go forward 50 years. What does life look like inside a ReGen Villages and outside ReGen Villages for the wider external community? So you slide the bar forward and it shows the blossoming, fruiting abundance and surplus, the positive externalities, reduce burdens on healthcare systems, reducing burdens on governments, fostering new economic models, brokering peaceful, happy places. I mean, gosh, that's not such a utopian idea. That's something that we can really achieve in our lifetime right now. All we have to do is just put logical infrastructure in place. So that's our thinking about capacity. Now, to talk about density, just to touch on this subject, we're currently involved in a project in South Africa for 1,200 homes. So that's one of the biggest ones we've done so far. And we're doing the spatial plan and the master plan for 1,200 home community, predominantly apartments, modular for different socioeconomic levels, but really interesting passive design apartments and townhomes. So essentially, we're trying to get as many people as possible into these communities. So it's not just regenerative resiliency for the wealthy folk.
So let's dive deep a little bit on what you mean around the regenerative resiliency piece. Maybe we could ground it within that South African community. What is the programming, the design, and what's really the essence of ReGen Villages and the scope that you're doing with that development?
Well, the first and foremost thing from our perspective is to use machine learning in our Village OS software to first and foremost understand what the land wants. The land can speak to us through geospatial mapping intelligence layers, right? And that also includes indigenous wisdom. So it's wildlife corridors, and it's understanding water flows and light aspects and wind, all the different things that the land itself is capable of in terms of supporting habitation from a circular and regenerative and resilient sort of lens. Then the software starts to place the wireframe homes and apartments and structures and infrastructure on that virtual piece of land. So that's really the goal, is like, okay, how can we look at what the land wants from a resiliency perspective, that those people living in that community have their needs met and are safe and secure. So it's really about safety and security and being prepared for fill in the blank district scale anomaly.
Hmm. I'm scratching my head around that, because is there times when it's just incompatible? I mean, if the land wants to be in oak savanna, and now you're having to layer in a somewhat dense development, how do you work with that, where it's looking at it through such a human lens, and of, okay, well, yeah, the land wants to do this, but we're also trying to make it produce for our own energy or food or whatever. Like, so how do you even bake that into an operating system?
Yeah, it's definitely a complex question, for which we feel that machine learning is well suited to understand and try to crack that nut.
Mm.
So from our perspective, it's understanding those compromises that are going to need to be made in order to put new build housing on pristine land, or land that is currently used for monoculture organic or other kinds of farming practices, or whether it's forest land or whether it's jungle. One of the projects we're working on right now is in Tulum in Mexico. And of course, the answer to most conservation folks and environmentalists would be no building there would be the right way forward. What the land really wants is nothing, just be jungle. And they're not necessarily wrong about that. At the same time, we have 10 billion people coming to Earth. We need housing solutions that work within nature and not separate from them. So our goal is to try to create a framework for the jungle or for the forest or for farmland that improves the biodiversity that supports those human settlements. And that's really the main perspective, is trying to find the right balance. It's an amazing question, though.
What does that look like for the improvement aspect of things? Like, what are some of the mainstays that you're seeing that go into the design of these communities?
Well, I mean, first and foremost, it's about creating safety, resiliency measures, so that people have access to sweet, potable water, even during drought, right? Key thing, to harvest and cistern and use humidity and conservation. I mean, water is critical, right? Being able to have access to clean food, organic, locally sourced, non-till soil, soil retention, the ability to nest more carbon into the soil than you take out, right? That's a big issue with current farming practices. The ability to have renewable energy and microgrids as load balancing. Again, not if, but when district utilities have a problem, these communities keep humming along. And the same thing with converting waste to resources. The neighborhood scale, human waste, animal waste, food waste is actually an asset class, right? It can be converted into heat, into energy, into biomass. It can be converted into plastics and fertilizers. It can be converted into lots of different things, which are useful in situ, right? But pumped kilometers away through a sewer line, it becomes a pathogen that requires lots of energy to mitigate, and it doesn't really do a very good job of that. So these are some of the critical pieces that we look at in terms of what we feel like machine learning software can help design and suggest and implement. And at the end of the day, you as a resident in the community are not surrounded by like interfaces and dashboards and toggles and all kinds of bells and whistles. You just happen to be living in a community when you turn the lights on, it works. You turn the water on, it works. When you flush a toilet, it works. Everything works. And you get those beautiful baskets of food delivered to your doorstep a few times a week. There's community that's involved and engaged, and people feel healthier, happier. That's our main driver, really.
Mm. Does it also update zoning codes? Because I think there's this like big gap. And I love that you're bringing up this nutrient cycle, because working on development projects, it's the hardest thing to either get the development team and the design team on board of saying, look, we're not bound by sewer system and septic systems. There's a third path that we're not even introducing into the conversation. And that's the team members that are on your side. Once you get to the planning department, it's a whole different ballgame. And I don't want to just underscore this for people, how restrictive development actually can be. We're going off of a playbook that was created definitely in the 20th century, if not the 19th century, to where, what do you find is the rub between, it sounds like there's a lot of technology that we have available today that is baked into your models, I'm sure, in the programming that goes into it. But people are still probably saying, this is the future. This is the future. How do you bring that together to say, no, this is actually now. We can do this right now, and we are doing this right now.
Yes, I think it's really important to note, and the reason why I sort of stole the moniker Tesla of eco villages from Elon Musk, is because the electric drivetrain is not new. Okay, it has always been known to be the most efficient drivetrain for mobility. The problem is it didn't fit the business model of some folks who have other systems and technologies and fuels, et cetera, carbon-based. So it took someone like Elon Musk to come along and with amazing designers and creators to make something sexy, that made something aspirational, that said, look, here's a vehicle that you don't have to be afraid that it's electric, right? Because, about charging or recharging. Here's a vehicle that has redefined the dashboard, redefined, autonomous, assisted driving, right? In many ways, it changed the game for auto manufacturing around the world. And so it took that kind of inspiration for the thinking to change. Now, we look at the same thing when it comes to residential real estate development, that we can show an incredibly interesting, immersive, video game-like environment, software environment that enables the key stakeholders, landowner, developer, government, especially communities, neighbors, to all be in a virtual sandbox and be able to toggle their objectives very easily in engaging ways. And every time they change their objectives or suggest an objective, that the software resimulates, listens to their input, and then puts and displays the updated version of that village or that community or the retrofit for everyone to look at and interact with. So we feel like that's going to be game changing for how these communities get the planning rules changed. So part of our software also is to ingest the rule books, local, regional, national, federal, because they're not black box. They exist, but they exist in lots of places and in different formats. So the key is, once we ingest those rule books, machine learning loves that complexity and can start to create a new overlay that can suggest better ways forward for planning.
Wow, that's incredible right there. I mean, to be able to sort the complexity of localized zoning codes that, and this goes back to another public service announcement, that like zoning codes are just like bolted on. They're taking bits and pieces that people think sound good, and they're going to create sometimes chaos, sometimes harmony. But if there's a way to drive more coherence in those, especially around resilience and sustainability and the patterns that support human habitation and really thriving for the environment as well, like what a game changer. How do you then bring in that design sensibility hopefully it's not learning based on what we've done in the 20th century of like, let's just create more suburbs. Like, how do you actually ensure that it has good design principles that has an outcome that is life-giving and supporting, rather than just, we're going to densify this and instead of, concrete, we're going to have permeable pavers and call it good.
Exactly the point. We look at informing or inoculating, if you will, machine learning algorithms with compassion, altruism, mindfulness. These are the kinds of things that I'm involved with at Stanford University, because I'm now currently involved in affiliated with the School of Medicine at the Center for Compassion, Altruism Research and Education under Dr. James Doty. And at C-Care, we focus on, and the thought process being, how we live and where we live that can reduce amygdala response. And amygdala response is the fight or flight syndrome, right? Which triggers cortisol release. And too much of that, of course, causes ill health. So, and just the right amount actually can lead to happy longevity. So that's related to the sort of blue zone research. So it's how can we inform these algorithms in terms of the right way forward to plan these communities that make sense logically for nature, make sense logically for human dignity and species dignity, but also enable these communities to continue to learn, right? Traditional neighborhood gets built, it's done, it's bought, it's sold, it's rented, whatever you want to call it. The parties move on, except for the people who live there. And then boom, the neighborhood is just sort of static. In ReGen Villages model, there's a local server infrastructure, like an edge computer, that essentially is continuously watching, monitoring, and seeking, like a mycelial network, right, to improve or mitigate against risk. And also, from an exciting perspective, to model new systems virtually, whether it's a power system, a water system, an energy system, whatever it may be, that the software can say, hey, this might work out really well in this community. So it's dynamic and it's growing. And that's where I feel really excited, very much akin to driving a Tesla, that every day you wake up and the car has had like a software upgrade and it knows the roads better. It knows your driving skills better. It's more attuned to who we are in the right way.
Before we get back into this episode, I want to share an exciting announcement about a very special opportunity to gather with some of the country's most innovative and pioneering professionals that are helping to grow the field of regenerative real estate. At the end of this summer, we are hosting the second annual Regenerative Real Estate Gathering that will be held outside of Portland, Maine at the Riverbend Farm. This year, our theme is from ownership to stewardship. And not only will attendees get a chance to hear from incredible speakers and organizations doing work around ecological resilience, inclusive real estate development, regenerative design, and advanced sustainable practices, but it is also an opportunity to connect, unwind, and play. This is an opportunity to nurture your spirit, to get inspired, and to connect with incredible people in a unique place that comes with certified living buildings, delicious organic feasts from the farm on site, swims in the rejuvenating Saco River, and activities like yoga and dance. Last year, we were blown away by the wide array of people from developers, architects, investors, planners, realtors, and earth stewards. To find out more about this special gathering, you can find the link in our show notes or go to our website at chooselatitude.com/gathering. I hope to see you there. That's so interesting. It makes me think of A Pattern Language by Christopher Alexander. And I'm curious if that's something like, is it able to pick up or ingest a work like that is all about what are those patterns of resilient habitation. I mean, it sounds like you could drive an incredible insights that we would just never have the ability to pick up on. Is
So
it a similar flavor?
you're hitting a very important theme and note, and it's not something that we normally speak to investors about because it's a little bit maybe outside of the wheelhouse for them to think about. But it's a lot of the things that we're most excited about are the things that we're going to expose and learn as a part of this work, as a part of the Village OS software, right? So where there's a network effect, where there's an opportunity for one system to learn from each other, to communicate with each other, currently siloed, that's an incredible opportunity to grow and to build our planning. And we really feel like that's a positive then feedback loop to taking this information and being able to express it in such a way that it really works for the benefit of all the stakeholders. And so, yeah, it's really about the nature of patterns that a mycelial network, because our Village OS software is inspired by inoculating mycorrhizal hyphae really under the forest floor. It's sort of similar to that. It's a network that is a sentient organism, but it doesn't have a central brain. It has intelligence at the point of sensing, and it's also self-healing. So, and they're huge organisms, by the way, and they're able to understand and broker lots of different information simultaneously across vast distances. So it's a really interesting model that has to do with patterns, connectivity, wisdom, and being able to create new neural pathways based on those patterns and those connections.
That's really interesting because especially like if you're placing a building, it's permanent, right? For at least for a long time. What kind of construction methods and things like that are you bringing in towards developing these communities?
Yeah, great question. I'm inspired by this revolution in prefab assembly line controlled environment construction. A lot of it now also moving towards robotic assist. This is mass timber, cross-laminated timber. You see in Germany, the Baltics, Sweden, there's a lot of movement towards this, moving now a little bit more towards the UK, somewhat here in the US, in Canada for sure too. And that's great because each one of these essentially warehouses and industrial construction buildings is able to produce several hundred homes a month off an assembly line, akin to like the old vehicle assembly lines. So I'm excited about that, especially being able to introduce better building materials like hemp, bamboo, other kinds of carbon sink aggregates that are really beneficial and can be eventually then reused or circular or composted. Then there's a renaissance happening. It's still nascent, but it's just beginning to sort of bud around 3D printing, 3D extrusion of residential typologies. Initially, it was single floor. Now I've seen 2 and 3 floor height, so quite large printers. We're seeing components also being printed in this way. There's a group I just visited not far from me here in Nevada City in California called GeoShip. And they have a really cool earthen ceramic polymer that they've developed that can be created and poured into these molds and essentially used not only for the cladding, but also the framing. And I mean, typically they're doing sort of geodesic shapes and domes, but they're fireproof, they're pest resistant, they have a great R value. So, there's a myriad of building methods and technologies which are coming to the fore now to hopefully inspire construction companies to think differently and material companies to think differently. If they can start investing in replacing, the material inside their cement trucks with hempcrete, for instance. Hemp is an amazing kind of resource. Hemp is a plant. You can get 6 to 8 yields a year. You can put some more nitrogen into the soil than it takes out. It is used for a variety of things, from oils and resins and fuel to food, nutrition, and yes, building materials. Has incredible tensile strength. So, and hempcrete is also pest resistant, mold resistant, flame retardant, and compostable when you're done with it.
Yeah, there's so much innovation going on right now in the building world, which is funny because we've largely not advanced in building construction for a long time. So it seems like you're looking at innovation that way, but what's ironic is it's almost harkening back to a human settlement way that we've inhabited this planet for a long time, in villages that are more resilient, that are more connected. And it's almost like reversing the pattern of what we've been doing. What's the playbook that you're using here, James? Like, do you become a developer? Do you become a software provider? What's the right product market fit that you've really seen? This is the right stones that we're gonna start to lay down.
So ReGen Villages is a Dutch holding company, so we're an EU entity. We're currently in the process of raising a Series A round. It's a €5 million lead investment. Our objective really is to create a software as a service platform around designing and operating regenerative, resilient neighborhood infrastructure. In addition to that, yes, we have also been a bit of a developer, or acted like a developer in some ways, at least in the process, and learning what the pain points are that most developers and landowners go through in terms of all the process. But we've been, as part of that, joint venturing and having these wonderful relationships with landowners around the world to work with them and to provide some spatial plan, master plan, and advocacy at the local government level. That's been really helpful and beneficial in getting the rules changed. So our goal really is to build ourselves as a software company, an entity, and have additionally sitting next to us, if you will, a certain amount of private equity and debt finance that could be a funnel to the right partners, the right real estate developers, landowners, governments, whatever we might call it, that can work through our Village OS software, where we could then be a facilitator for that mezzanine finance. We could then help get the full project built. And then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? So we've connected very broadly to sovereign wealth, pension funds, institutional funds. They're all inspired by our vision. They all want to now put their money into these ESG, SDG, metric-based real estate developments that are, of course, asset-backed, right, by the land, and have good potential for long-term, revenue, return. But at the same time, have impact, climate and social governance impact. So we're kind of perfectly positioned at this moment, we feel like, to be able to bridge those worlds, and moreover care deeply that we can help those landowners and those developers see their projects through to fruition, which is very different than other products and services or other kinds of consultant companies.
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting landscape to land in. There's a lot more money that seems to be flowing into regenerative agriculture, with these impact investors saying, yeah, we want to build the soil and draw carbon down, but they're relying on the same fund structures that requires the land to be appreciating, tenant farmers to be paying for the cash flows, and then they've got to liquidate it whenever the fund sunsets, and they're expecting, I don't know, a better outcome. And so they're like, well, how do we actually put enough money into a deal to make this work? Not just a little bit of money, but enough money where they're able to get their yield requirements. But if you layer in housing and other infrastructure and improvements that's integrated, you don't see a lot of people that are doing that. And I think more and more that we're going to be going in that direction. I'm really excited to see that you're putting this together of not just, we want to go out and build communities, but here's how we can continuously improve upon it and build upon itself, because that's something that I can imagine. And I'm curious where the user experience is going to be from a software perspective of like, what is that user experience? Like if I had a large piece of land, would I be able to put inputs and then see different design configurations, or how does that come about?
Yes, absolutely. So first and foremost, going back to the conversation or the topic about investors, our goal has been to, how can we model this so that they get at least a 15% rate of return, IRR, from the residential development and within a 5-year terminal value, right? So that's key. Within 3 to 5 years, if you can turn 15% rate of return, or better, then that's the baseline. So that's what we've determined with all this regenerative resilient components and everything built in. Moreover, we're convinced, because we have this huge demand that comes through our website every single day by families and people who want to live in these kinds of communities, that side by side, a regenerative resilient neighborhood next to a traditional subdivision, absolutely the one that's the regenerative resilient community is going to sell out immediately, because it has all of these amenities that support human planetary flourishing and safety measures, which is what people care about a lot now, and now more than ever. The other traditional subdivision is going to languish. So that's going to then drive, we feel, residential developers to say, wait a second, we need a tool like this. We need to develop like this. We need to compete in this world, just like the car manufacturers are now having to scramble to create electric drivetrains to go after Elon. So what's the user experience? Okay. The idea is, because I come from a gaming background, video games, and I really understand you need instant gratification. You need to understand, first of all, that you're a layperson, you don't have technical skills. Got it. You basically open up the software, for kind of registration, whatever it is, sort of normal idea, that you can search for your land, basically by address. It brings up the land, it brings up the map, and either what the land boundary already is based on government data, which will come through our Village OS software, or you can draw a bounding box, which represents your land grant, your basically your borders of your land. The moment you do that, then software starts to think about, okay, what's possible on this land from a permaculture, regenerative, resilient lens, all those different geospatial layers. And then from an instant gratification perspective, starts to suggest through visualization the kind of village or infrastructure that could start to take shape there. Then yes, you have the ability to toggle number of units, kinds of units, the demographics, all of those things can start to take shape. And every time you toggle those objectives, very simply, right, all of a sudden the software takes that and resimulates. So there's a process where the fidelity on the resolution of that visualization will just get better and better and better, to the point where eventually the end result will be this immersive 3D environment that's first web-based, so you don't need all the goggles and everything else to get into, but you can fly around, you can see how things work, you can toggle also a timeline of what the future looks like on this community. So then it starts to show all of the positive indications going forward. And then the software is then capable of inviting other stakeholders into the mix. So you as the landowner, you're happy, you've done this all by yourself, maybe your family, your kids, everyone's sort of excited. It's playful, it's easy. And it didn't cost you a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of what you would have to spend with that full ecosystem to get to that kind of planning. Then you start to invite the other stakeholders, maybe a real estate developer, local developer who might want to be your boots on the ground. Maybe you want to engage some local neighbors who you think might be favorable, or you want to learn, where the position is. Then you can also invite the local government, and you're at a point where you're not just speaking to them with a napkin on a table. You're talking to them with a plan that they can actually look at, and they can understand the traffic implications, the productive implications for that land, and what the necessity is to change the rules related to that. So it's really to spur how these projects can happen faster. So that's really the user experience that we're shooting for on the design side, eventually leading to approvals and a blueprint. That's the goal.
That's
then on the operations side, hey, green light project, fantastic, exciting. Well, guess what? That's the perfect place then to put the Village OS server into the community. So once it's built, it's able to see what's going on and be a 24/7 facilities manager / guru, if you will, predicting based on weather patterns or other kinds of anomalies, but also interacting with other communities in similar climate zones around the world to improve.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I mean, already it makes a lot of sense to be able to scale jump for even communities to understand when peak load is, and going in that direction of microgrids and being able to regulate spikes and energy. I want this software just for even residential uses. Like how amazing would it be if somebody could type in their address and here's everything that could be possible? Are you thinking more in just in this development arena, or is it potential disruptor of residential design?
Like I said, we were born out of the solar decathlon competition, which is a single family home context. So we understand it, and we think it's important to be able to do retrofits and also new designs for single family homes. But to be perfectly honest, we have a housing crisis that's global, and we have to be thinking about neighborhood development and neighborhood retrofits. Not to say that I'm against the single family context, and that eventually we could actually see the software doing that and being able to provide solutions. But certainly coming out of the gate, we will be focusing on the greenfield and the urban retrofit rather than the single family kind of initiator. It also has a lot to do with costs, right? Because when you start to look at the relative cost of all these different systems, I mean, gosh, you get such a wonderful bang for your buck if you have a few hundred housing units that are interconnecting across a microgrid. You're sharing that cost, in other words. You're amortizing those costs. It really makes it affordable at that point. Whereas at the single family context, unless you're really wealthy, it's probably more cost prohibitive. And also when it comes to like farming and regenerative resiliency, we can look at projects that are smaller, but the smallest we've looked at right now is probably 40 homes on 7 acres. 40 townhomes on 7 acres. Yeah.
Well, you mentioned that you're incorporated out of the Netherlands. Where's the market? What's the market strategy? Are you primarily working in the global north and in Western countries, or are you looking at the developing world?
Look, our goal is to be global, to replicate and scale, right? And ideally, the vision has and continues to be the global south. That's for us the pointing outside the ballpark, right? Because we have the next 2 billion people coming to the planet, primarily are coming to sub-Saharan Africa, to India, across ASEAN. And we need to be able to create a new model for the middle class and the aspiring middle class to live in these kinds of self-reliant neighborhoods and villages and communities and retrofits, so that we have a fighting chance for this kind of expansion of humanity. So our goal is really is to get to that sort of social, affordable, rural housing developments. We are and have cut our teeth on the Dutch landscape, the Norwegian landscape, Portugal, in South Africa, in looking at land opportunities, Thailand, in lots of different places. But we want to be able to come into a place and be able to say to that local community who's been struggling to get access to housing, that they now finally have a place that they can call home. Living inside these communities where, yes, there's a segment of social, there's a segment of affordable, there's a segment of middle class, civil service, kind of affordable, but a little bit higher rate. And then there's the market rate of the more affluent, but they can all live nicely together in the same neighborhood. Mm-hmm. Why not?
A whole community.
Mm-hmm.
What is it like from building this investment side, where if you're incorporated out of the Netherlands and you're, let's say, a US investor, is it the same path of growth that a US company would take if you're going through your series round and then ultimately you're going public? And what do you go public on the Dutch stock exchange, or that this is a whole mystery for me?
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. So really, what it comes down to is, obviously we have to discuss terminal value and exit strategies, right? For us, we're not exiting. We're interested in building a very big, and by big I mean successful company that is doing what it says it's going to do in terms of people and planet and yes, returning for our investors. Through that lens, we were capable of imagining dividends, or imagining potentially being acquired at some point, maybe by a much larger company that would be interested in taking this to those next levels through their capacities. But we don't necessarily, we could also imagine potentially a public offering, and that could happen, as a NASDAQ expression. It happens often that European entities can have a Delaware entity that becomes a public entity. And we picked the Netherlands for a variety of reasons. We picked Europe for a variety of reasons. And we also believe, quite honestly, and this may shift for us too, that UAE is a tremendously exciting place. That United Arab Emirates is hosting the COP28, the UN Forum on Climate Change, coming up in December. But the difference with COP28, that's different than all of the previous COPs, we feel, is that UAE is poised to learn from all the previous COPs and act precipitously and fund the solution sets. So we're really bullish on the potential for either co-locating or maybe even relocating some of what we're doing to UAE.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I mean, this is such a wild time to be doing this. I mean, in the New York Times just yesterday, I was reading about the capital city of Jakarta in Indonesia getting moved to a completely separate island. My work had taken me to the Maldives, where their plan B is to move their entire population from this archipelago nation to the middle of Australia. And you see this in indigenous villages in the United States and Alaska, that whole communities are just having to move because of climate change. And so how do you do that? How do you plan for a changing environment where we need to create new habitation and do it in a way where we're not going to wreak havoc on that environment as well? So I think this is just such a really interesting and incredible way to drive innovation and to drive change. Let me do two parting questions. I think this is going to be my favorite, but you had mentioned Buckminster Fuller and some other folks. Who do you really get a lot of influence from? And it could be present or past that you really find that you are in that lineage of with your work.
Well, my dad, rest his soul, he passed a couple of years ago, but he was 94, and up until the day he passed, he was a physicist and an inventor, and had scores of patents under his name, and was presenting and pitching to investors, at 94, and so resilient and optimistic, infinitely optimistic. Right, such a role model for me, and I would say then my son, Louis, who's 12, sees the world in such an integrated fashion that it allows me to, through his eyes, sort of see what's possible, and I'd say those, in connection with the folks that I've studied and am deeply influenced by and impacted by, like Bucky Fuller and Rudolf Steiner and Bill Mollison and others, that there's great insight that can be obtained from just quietly reflecting on what your heart says and what your spirit says, and it goes back to those farm to table experiences that we started the conversation with. Why am I feeling so happy sitting at this farm to table? What is going on? Is it the food? Is it the wine? Is it the conversation? Could be the wine, I guess, but it also has to do with the fact that I'm sitting next to where my food just came from, and it's like pulsating inside me. So those are the inspirations, I would say, that that people share all around the world, actually.
My next question, I think you've already answered it, was going to be around optimism, but it sounds like you are forever an optimist. James, this was an incredible opportunity to learn more about ReGen Villages. If people are interested in learning more and investing and signing up for a future home, or they want to develop a neighborhood, like what are the pathways in which people can engage and learn more about what you're doing?
Well, my email address is james@regenvillages.com. So that's pretty easy. I can also be reached at my Stanford email, which is jamese@stanford.edu. In terms of the other interest in ReGen Villages, I would say our website, which is regenvillages.com. Pretty straightforward.
Fantastic. Great. And it's a beautiful website. It's very intriguing. I hope for all our sakes that we're going to be able to make this transition into a more resilient, sustainable, and beautiful world. So thank you for your time and for coming on.
Thank you so much, Neal. This has been amazing.
If you want to follow our work at Latitude, you can follow us on Instagram at latitude.regenerative.re, and mine is @IamNealCollins. We inherently believe in the potential that comes from connecting value-aligned and purpose-driven people together in community. That's why I encourage you to join our mighty network and introduce yourself to the other people working across the globe to advance a more regenerative, resilient, and beautiful world. Here, we want to know what you're working on and what inspires you. Through this platform, you can attend live events, take courses provided by our podcast guests, and create connection with other people and businesses that share your same passion. To join, find the link in our show notes or visit our website at chooselatitude.com. If you'd like to support the show, please share it with your friends and be sure to follow us on your podcast app so that you always have the latest episode downloaded. Another way to support our regenerative field building is to leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. Positive ratings help attract amazing guests, and they can be the deciding factor for someone else to tune in and listen. And who knows, maybe this is the kind of motivation that it takes for them to finally decide to align their profession with their sustainable and regenerative values and become a positive force for good within their own community. This show was produced by myself and edited by Anthony Wallace and offered as a part of our work with Latitude Regenerative Real Estate.